am Pal Comic Book Guy with your host, Andrew Leonard.
And Chris Ramos.
Tonight, we are talking about the Avengers Omnibus Volume 1.
We're going old school, back to the beginning.
This covers Avengers 1 through 30. And also, just to put it more in perspective, this covers stories from 1963 till 1966.
And everyone knows the Avengers because of the Avengers movies, of course. But even long before that, everyone read the Avengers because they were super mega popular.
Yes.
And they never really had like a part where they were lowering in their popularity, I think. The Avengers was always capitalizing on like the top tier heroes of the day. So some of the other books like X-Men and even some of the later like what was it, the Invaders or the Defenders?
Yep, both of those.
Some of those kind of just
they want to be.
They stopped publishing just because they weren't popular. But the Avengers have always held strong. In fact, the Avengers is one of the longer running solid continual books. Their numberings got kind of weird because they stopped stories and started stories, but they've been always running.
Yeah. I know they're past 400. I think they're probably, if you were to do a continuity, I bet it'd be like in the 600s.
And that's pretty good. They started out in the 60s and, you know, Batman and Superman just hit like 1,000. So
yeah.
You think of
they're celebrating 80 years.
Yeah. So the Avengers have always been one of the mainstays in the Marvel universe. And this omnibus is, of course, a hardcover collected edition.
Yes.
They've gathered all of the issues that you cannot really afford anymore.
Yep. That you can only see in a display case and go, ooh, that looks neat.
Oh, like Avengers 1, $12,000.
That's nice. Obviously, these stories are written by Stan the Man Lee, along with Larry Lieber and Paul Linkman. And the two majority of the pencilers, along with a third one, is Jack Kirby, the King. Don Heck and Dick Ayers fills in for an issue. At least the first around 16 issues are Jack Kirby, and then Don Heck takes over for the rest of the book.
So what was the year that Avengers 1 came out?
1963.
1963. Cool. So we were kind of looking at some of the other dates of the characters because the story goes for the Fantastic Four that Stan Lee came up with Fantastic Four in response to the Justice League doing so well at DC Comics.
Uh-huh.
So Marvel said, hey, we got to put together our own group. And just when Stan Lee was going to say, I'm done writing comics, he was writing like Westerns and romance novels and things. And he said, I'm not going to do the comics anymore.
His Fantastic Four came out in 1961.
61, yeah. So him and Jack Kirby, of course, wrote Fantastic Four #1 as a team, a group, a family, and did so well. So they've since then paired up a lot of popular comic book characters.
Let's take the best of our characters in our books and put them together.
Yeah, at the time, they were the best. The original Avengers lineup, Iron Man, Hulk, Ant-Man, Wasp, and Thor.
Yes.
That was the originals.
Mm-hmm. And this was before the first issue does not include Captain America.
Right. It was Avengers #4.
Yes.
That first brought Captain America back from
ice.
People say back from the dead, back from ice. But the funny thing, and I love Captain America as a character, so I know a lot about his history. So I always love just like blah, blah, blah about Captain. But Captain America #1 came out in 1940. And it was a year before the U.S. was bombed at Pearl Harbor. Yep. So we weren't even in World War II. And Jack Kirby, and was it Joe Simon? Jack Kirby, Joe Simon? Yep. They came out with Captain America #1, and on the cover, he is punching Hitler.
Yes.
And so it was sort of like Marvel Comics has declared war on Hitler, and the United States of America is like, we're not in World War II yet. Mm-hmm. So it was just a bold statement.
Yeah.
And so Avengers #1 comes out. Avengers 2, Avengers 3, and then in Avengers 4, the return of Captain America.
Right.
I will own that issue someday. I will.
Wow, that's
I've said it here first.
Wow, you heard it. So I guess what's memorable, I guess, about these characters is how they first get introduced. It's really interesting looking at the movie, then going back to the original comic and going, wow, this is where they started. This is the historical context that we get. And I always nerd about that too, because as a lover of Jack Kirby and everything Kirby did, he was really I think he was playing with all his toys into the toy box and he's like, oh, let's see what we can do here. Oh, this looks neat.
What always gets me too is like Thor. Okay, so Thor in Avengers number 1,
Yeah.
he literally has like the same costume that he is still wearing like
Yeah.
to this day.
Yeah,
And
it's slightly changed in like the past like 5 years.
Yeah. But for a long run, it just never changed. And it's cool when you get it right. You know, like Spider-Man, they got it right and they never changed it.
Yeah.
And the early Avengers stories are, I want to say, a little more like all over the place. That's
Yes.
kind of a bad way to say it.
Yeah, they were still trying to find out what people resonate with.
Or what should the
especially
team do? Like,
yeah,
they're the Avengers now.
right.
What?
I think also for these big team up books, it's how do you present a threat to the most powerful superheroes?
Yeah. And we always talk about that. You know, they have to band together because they're the most powerful in the world. You know, we talked about some of our past podcasts of that's why people put together teams, because you want the best players on your team. So they take.
They can't do it on their own.
Yeah. In Marvel's case, they took the top selling characters of the day
Yeah.
and threw them into a book together. But like Iron Man, even Iron Man didn't get his own series until 1968.
Yeah.
So it was quite a while for him to build up his own.
Because he kind of started in Tales of
following.
Suspense, and then he
Yeah.
was here, and then Iron Man started on his own finally. He was kind of the one that took a little bit longer. Ant-Man had a little bit before, I think, this book, but his popularity wasn't huge.
Yeah.
Speaking of huge, he goes from the identity of Ant-Man, and then he's the Giant Man, and then he's back and forth. So he has identity crisis. His wife has always been the Wasp.
Yeah. And, you know, it's funny you mentioned Giant Man because I always, okay, so the first thing I guess I should tell everyone is when you go back and you read stories like these that Stan wrote in the 60s, you have to
put your mind into the 60s. You have to think of the historical context. I mean, you got to think about how they would approach something like that.
We can't pick on the stories, but because it was in the day, it was right?
Yeah.
So it's like watching old sitcoms from the 50s, you know, and you just, you know, the Brady Bunch in the 60s and 70s. And so it's like, all right, you have to put yourself in that time period of life and say, this is kind of how people talked and it's kind of how they expected to read comics. Stan Lee was very descriptive as a writer, where he felt like he had to explain everything happening in that panel. If someone was jumping, Stan had to say, I'm jumping. And if someone was...
Or he's thinking, he's in thought. He's very brooding, and he had to describe that feeling.
And some of that goes back to like the Marvel way that we've talked about in the past. Yeah. Like how they drew and then they fill in the words after the drawings.
Yep, the Marvel method.
So many of these early stories are just like, I want to say almost like mini stories within a larger story. Like something's happening and it's resolved, and then they run over here and that's done. And then an alien's now in the book. And they're like, what's happening there? And then they don't know how to write some characters. So for a while, they didn't really find their voice. So he just kind of wrote bad dialogue to just sort of give them something to do.
Right.
Like the Wasp.
Yeah. I mean, she's portrayed as very young, still naive, kind of finding she just is part of a team, and she's kind of learning how to work with these larger than life people.
Yeah, and like everyone else, like Thor, of course, he's just very like, I will do this and you get out of my way, or you'll be
They
crushed.
would
And
get into fights a lot.
yeah, and he was
They would
just
fight a lot between
very
each
like
other.
ready to just throw down. And so they took the Wasp character as this
She wasn't a
like
damsel in distress, though.
no, she was just like what I guess they imagined females were thinking in the day. So almost every instant she was like, this is going to mess my hair. And like she talks about like
Yeah.
what costume or what dress am I going to wear tomorrow? And then someone would say, get your head in the game. We're fighting a villain. And, she's like,
They would
oh,
build opportunities though for her to like be the hero of the story when like all the heroes can't do something. Later
yeah,
on, they do give her more opportunities to
she
do
shrunk down
something.
really small and all
Yeah.
that. So yeah, of course, then like we talked about, Captain America joins the team, and
Yes.
at first, he Captain America coming back to the comics was a big thing for Jack Kirby, because Jack Kirby
You
worked on Captain America through the 40s, and fun fact. After World War II, Captain America lost popularity because
the war was over.
yeah, they didn't know what to do with him
Yeah.
anymore. Some other characters that were around, like Superman and Batman, and they moved on to different storylines
Yeah.
because they were like their own characters. Captain America was made almost as a propaganda piece a little
Yeah.
bit.
It took a little bit to flesh out like other intentions for the character.
Yeah,
and
so
give him
they
something to do.
just sort of had his comics just fizzle, and he just disappeared. Like they just stopped printing the comics,
Yeah.
and they had a few issues where Captain America was still doing things, and then they just stopped publishing comics, and that was like in 1945. And then in Avengers number 4, Captain America is found by the Avengers, frozen in ice.
And became the man out of time.
Yes, and they said, "Oh my gosh, this is the hero from the old." And he told them that him and Bucky Barnes were trying to stop a missile, and he fell. The missile exploded, and he was frozen in the
Yep.
ocean, I guess.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
all these years, which actually they later on put a time that he had been lost for 66 years.
Yeah.
And so he
That's a
said
long
all this
time.
time he had been frozen. That was the first time in the comics that anyone ever heard that Captain America was frozen in ice. Because when his original comic just ended in the 40s, he just sort of stopped.
Right.
It would
so
be
they
cool.
have to figure out like a
Like,
comic way
how
to
did this
figure that
happen?
out. Yeah. So I think they've really developed like Captain America, and that's how they kind of voiced him and him trying to figure out how to fit into society. And you see that in the movies today where Chris Evans, who portrayed him, kind of really capitalized on those feelings and how
Mhm.
to do that.
Yeah, because I mean, if you really did thaw out, the time in comics is skewed a little bit,
Yeah.
the way that they handle years. But if you really did thaw out, and now you were part of this team, he almost had no,
Nothing of his life.
yeah, and he had like the only thing he knew was how to lead and fight, and he saw there was injustice, and so he says, "I'll step up and do that." And the Avengers comic kind of starts playing on um, who is going to be the leader and why.
Yes.
It was like a
and
big
they
thing.
have meetings.
Mhm.
Some meetings, and they got to get majority rule, and from like the founding members, and that they establish is Captain America finally becomes one of the founding members later on. They established that, but it's Thor, Iron Man, Ant-Man and the Wasp, and yeah.
So the omnibus does a great job of not recoloring. I want to say remastering, right?
Yeah.
They remaster all the old comics so you can get the storylines, and it's the right place to start. It's a big read. It's a lot to go through, but if you're going to do like a complete run through of the Avengers line, you have to start here.
Yep.
And you really get the idea of how these characters' personalities play out. Um,
There's a reason why the Hulk's not on the team.
yeah, yeah. It also introduces like Kang the Conqueror. That's one of their big
Yep.
villains.
And it's cool because this is King. That was King's first appearance in. I got
Seven,
this.
8, number.
Yeah, number 8.
I did it, number
Yep,
8.
no, 1964.
And then they
So-
introduce later on Hawkeye
Yep,
and
Baron Zemo came back. They did a
Scarlet
lot of
Witch,
Scarlet
Wanda.
Witch, yeah, Quicksilver. They came back from the X-Men. They crossed them over and became mainstays. That was really cool.
Doctor Doom is in this.
Yep,
volume.
he makes an appearance, as well as the Fantastic Four. But I think they deliberately had to make a distinction between the Avengers and the Fantastic Four and how they lead and how they act versus the Fantastic Four. I think Stan and Jack had to figure that out.
Yeah, and it kind of follows one of the tropes of the day that each hero has its own like Achilles heel. Captain America, if he loses his shield, he's like,
Yep.
Iron Man always has some sort of servo breakdown. Or
He runs out of power. He goes,
loses
"Ooh!"
electricity, and then he's in this
Yep,
metal
powerless.
shell.
Yep, I'm just punching.
Thor actually
is pretty much the strongest one.
But he is, in this storyline, banished to Earth.
Yeah, he can't leave Earth for a long time. He couldn't.
And he's the doctor. What Blake? Right?
Donald Blake.
Donald Blake. He's the doctor. So he goes to Earth as a human, and he has a cane. And when he strikes his wooden cane on the ground, he turns into Thor, and he has a hammer. And if he ever
a thing they haven't really used in the movies.
Yes. Yeah.
They haven't really introduced that concept.
They got rid of that guy.
Yeah.
And then if he loses if he's not holding his hammer for more than a minute, I think.
Yeah,
right?
a couple minutes. I think it's like 5 minutes.
He reverts back to wimpy Donald Blake.
Yeah, he's just the doctor.
So it is.
Sometimes they have to bring the doctor to fix somebody.
It is funny because he's always trying to hide this alter ego. Like he's this alternate person. So he's always like, oh no, I'm going to turn back to Dr. Blake. And he hides behind a rock. So that no one knows that that's him.
Yeah, they really played with secret identities.
Yep. Iron Man, no one knew that he was Tony Stark at this time.
Yeah.
So
he'd always be like, hey, that guy Tony Stark, he has a lot of money.
Yeah.
He's going to build us some Avengers
He'll
mansion.
buy another jet. Don't worry. You'll be fine.
Yeah.
I'll tell him I'm his bodyguard.
Yeah, that's right. Iron Man was his bodyguard. And that was put to rest in the first movie. The MCU did. Oh, yeah, I'm Iron Man. And I know he's like, what? Oh, they did that? Okay.
Yep, that's over now. And then Giant Man, Ant-Man,
yep,
same person. And then Wasp, they start this love triangle thing with the Wasp that he and her are trying to kind of
they're still in a relationship, but there's always strengths and weaknesses and strengths, and
the
they
Wasp
try to play with
we're
that.
on a break and
and
goes out with other guys.
Yeah, she's always jealous of Thor and Tony Stark, and
then when Hawkeye is introduced, he's all over Wasp all the time.
Yeah.
So you kind of are able to do that with the characters. You're able to just play around with their personalities. Stan Lee actually is pretty good at that, just sort of randomly throwing in little quips and little things that people say. You give him a lot of credit for establishing the early ideas of these characters. Some people pick on Stan because they say, he has one way of writing and he'll write that way for 100 years if you let him, right? But he was the first one to say, these are the characters, these are what they look like, this is how they interact with each other, this is what they care about, this is what they don't. And he had a great way of just coming up with villains. Now, of course, the artist came up with how villains costumes should look, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Stan was also very involved with that part of it, you know? And so he just had a good idea of now that we made these characters, and made like the foundation of their personality, then we can build on that, but these
Right.
are like the building blocks of the Avengers.
Yeah.
And it's 30 comics in this book, but was it like 1,000 pages?
Oh
Not really.
yeah, this finishes out at, well, not quite 1,000. Actually, it's shorter. It's just a bigger book. It finishes out at 713
Oh,
pages.
that's an easy one. That's an easy read.
That's a weekend. That's a weekend.
That's a weekend.
That's what I call it.
Now, for the currently, as of the recording of this podcast, there are 4 initial Avenger Omnibus
Yep.
that collect from the 60s and into the 70s.
Yep. But then there's a couple that are like, oh, this is our 80s, 90s run. And then there's the early 2000s epic with George Perez and Kurt Busiek. And then there's like Uncanny that's in the back end. And
They've always sort of revamped the Avengers as a team.
yeah.
It's one of the teams in the Marvel universe that has 100 member.
They kept growing. It very seldomly did they take a character away. What they did initially was the trinity of Captain America, Thor, and Iron Man. They kind of moved away from that, but they would still try to bring back Iron Man and Thor when it was appropriate.
Yeah, like they would bring in new characters to be on the Avengers. They'd say, well, you're an Avenger now.
Yep.
Like when Hawkeye came in and Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver.
Yes.
So they said, all right, we're bringing 3 people in. So instead of doing a comic now with 8 people, we're just going to take 3 out.
Yeah.
So they kind of
rotate them.
Yeah. And then they went on to be in their own stories,
Exactly.
One thing that I do love that they used to do in the old Marvel comics is they used to like bring up a storyline, like Captain America would return in an issue to fight with the Avengers, and they'll be like, "Where have you been, Cap?" And then Stan Lee would put in there like
the reference.
Yeah, he's been busy off world fighting,
Yeah.
on the moon. See Captain America number 65.
Right.
So it kind of made you, as a young reader, to say, "I want to get that issue because I want to see
It's
what the
all
heck's
connected.
going on."
They always kept the Marvel universe connected.
And that was the job of the editor.
Yeah.
They needed to look at these, read through them, and then they were the ones who made sure that the continuity wasn't all messed up.
Yeah.
And that the stories weren't crossing over in the wrong ways.
It had to be a task.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
Especially when they kept adding books, because even when the Avengers was going on, so Avengers came out 1960, early 60s,
63,
right?
Yep.
Thor had his own book. Then Hulk had his own book. Iron Man got his late 60s, but then the X-Men were going on.
Yep.
Doctor Strange was going on. I mean,
they started,
it was an entire
machine,
multi-universal machine that they've been building and building. And we all give them credit for jumping from one character to the next and trying to like stay within that character, right?
Yes.
Of course, Dr. Doom is in this. He's my guy. He's my favorite.
He makes his appearance. He's like, I will take you down, Avengers. And they they go to the Fantastic Four, and they're like, oh, can you help? Oh, we're kind of busy, but we'll help when we get there. Okay.
Well, that was another great way they did that too, because if you were an X-Men fan, or if you were a Fantastic Four fan and you were reading through those books, then you heard that they're going to appear in the Avengers. That was
you wanted to pick up
way,
that issue.
Yeah, to bring over those fans and have them read a few issues of the Avengers. And you know what? Usually they get hooked into these characters too.
Yeah.
Black Widow is in here too.
Black Widow, yes. Black Widow does make an appearance.
Her costume.
Yeah, she didn't start as Scarlett Johansson portrayed her. It was a little different.
It was
you
like
look up that like fishnets,
fishnet head to toe.
Yep, and she
like a big
still
mask.
had her stingers. I think she still had her wrist stingers. That was kind of the mainstay. But you still spy.
Still spy with Shield. With Shield a lot.
And she was always very mysterious, especially when she started getting involved with Hawkeye and kind of playing around with that relationship. That kind of happens more in the second volume, but they start. I think they lay some of the groundwork here. That was very cool. The brother and sister relationship of the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. That begins, or at least it's more capitalized in here, especially Quicksilver. Quicksilver always has to protect Wanda. And likewise, Wanda always has to protect that. That's their first priority. If one of them goes missing, that's a whole issue. We got to go find them.
Yeah. And they're like,
they will remind you that we have to go find them and we got to set this right.
So the fun thing about this is we always talk about collected editions, and that's, the first idea that we had for this podcast was, let's talk about the value and the the joy of reading a collected edition.
Yes.
This part is exactly what this is made for. Trying to collect Avengers number 1 through 30 can happen. You can do it, but it's very difficult. And, if you wanted to go out and really get the single issues, no joke, this whole book would cost you $50,000, if not more, because they're just,
and you won't be able to read them because you'll want to.
Yeah.
They'll be all brown. You'll be like, what?
Like, forget it. I'm not touching them. And that way you can read them all in order. So after I started reading Avengers Omnibus number 1, then I went on and read Omnibus number 2, and then now I'm reading number 3. And
I'll eventually get to number 3.
I'll eventually get to number 4.
We'll eventually finish it all one day.
Yeah, maybe next month I'll do number 4. I'm trying not to get Avengers burnout, but it is a really great way to see all of these changes, because in the second omnibus and the third omnibus, Stan Lee kind of starts just being like an editor, not a writer. You get different artists that jump in. You get different costume changes, and you get different villains. Each writer has an idea that they want to bring in.
A little overarching arc, or at least a character development arc, that they'll be like planting seeds, and they're going, okay, so Wanda and Quicksilver are working out, we're going to eventually use them, and then they're going to go do their own thing. What can we do to bring that in? We'll bring other characters to the fold. Let's see what other new relationships we can do. Things like that.
Yeah, it's kind of like when TV series get spin-offs, because some of the characters become so popular that people would be willing to watch another whole series of them. And that's exactly what they did in these comics, is they introduced characters, like bringing back Captain America. I mean, that was great. And it just brought him into a totally different decade and a totally different generation of readers, right?
Yes.
And they were like, we didn't grow up with Captain America, but he's pretty cool. So they started writing more intriguing storylines for him.
I do appreciate that they kept the origin of the Avengers kind of at the core of it is they all have to band together to fight Loki. I'm glad in the MCU they did that. Yeah. Even though it was for a larger purpose beyond that, we find out later. Like watching that first Avengers movie and kind of going back and thinking about this, they still kept those concepts.
Yeah, because it was like, who will be the Avengers' first villain? Yep. Who should it be? If they were going to come up with a brand new villain, maybe. But the very first issue
is Loki.
Yep. Yep. And of course, Thor jumps right in. So you're like, you're in it. And it's, I mean, the action is there, which is great. But you just have to remember that these are leading into larger stories. All these characters are leading into larger story arcs. Yep. So if you were to go pick this up, again, it's called The Avengers Marvel Omnibus Volume 1. It is still out there.
You're going to have to look gaunt.
Yeah, it's a little out of print. They do come back and make new printings of these. And in fact, this is probably maybe the second or third new printing of this already. But cover price is $99.99 US dollars. And you can kind of look around and see where you can find that.
Yeah, good luck. Capture those whales.
Yeah, right.
A whale is a hard to find book.
Very hard to find. The white whale. It's out there. You'll get it. But it's a great way to start your read. And we encourage you to not only read modern stories, but to go back to the beginning.
Where it
And
all started.
you can read this digitally, you can read this however you like, but we are big fans of the collected editions, and I think the Avengers is a great way to start.
Yes, I really enjoyed this book, and we hope you do too. In Stan's words, Excelsior.
Yes.
Thank you, true believers. This is Andrew Glauner
And Chris Ramos,
signing off.
goodbye.